Welcome to part 2, Why We Post. So, the question of why we post is a treacherous topic, and I think it's open to many reactionary perspectives, right? And it can get a bit carried away. So we're going to try and approach it soberly. Okay.
There's moral panic perspective, there's narcissism,
empty,
selfish,
vacuous, selfish, formativity, you're giving yourself away, you don't know how to be an ordinary person, you're losing your humanity, like all those things, right? And I think there are good arguments that selfies posting and constant image curation are psychologically and socially damaging. Like some of those arguments I think are very convincing. But I think there are equally good arguments that selfies posting and constant image curation enhance self-expression. They can be really meaningful to people. So I think we've always got to be too careful about not throwing ourselves too deeply into some of these kind of really charged perspectives.
Yeah.
We tend to focus on image-obsessed teenagers when we talk about this. And I think that that's always the go-to, is like imagining this kind of age bracket of people who are obsessed with this kind of thing. And I think that that's empirically false. I don't know that there's much evidence that that's true.
Yeah.
I think people just pick that demographic because it's an easy one to pick. So you go, teenagers care about image. Selfies are image creation. Presto. Yep. I mean, you must know about this in other work you've done.
Yeah, it's definitely again, the moral panics around young people, and it's like replicate old moral panics, just kind of turn them old moral panics into new online moral panics. Certainly, it's like the old thing that, young people aren't politically engaged and all that kind of stuff, and, but as if old people are, right? So there's usually very few distinctions going on between these. There is qualitative differences, definitely generational differences. Anyone that's tried to help their parents with a computer will know this kind of stuff, but as long as you accept that you're going to be the problem in the future for someone younger, it seems to be when we get older we forget that and denigrate young people all the time. And forget what it's like to be young, and forget what that was like for you. Yeah, there's something in that, and I've written about this elsewhere, about how it has something to do as we get older, we start to feel that we're getting closer to death and irrelevance, and we're not cool anymore, and we don't like this, and therefore we kind of turn that anger into
And I think even empirically, if you go to a scenic spot near where you live, you'll see older people taking selfies there.
Yeah,
that's right. Or asking them to be taken, and so it is. It's intergenerational. It's also spread geographically. People do it all around the world, of all different backgrounds. Mobile phones become quite ubiquitous. Obviously, it's not total in access, but it is ubiquitous. And selfie culture is huge in other parts of the world as well.
And I'd say platforms make a difference here too. I mean, TikTok's not a platform I'm on. I'm too old for that. It's kind of there'll be new ones. There's So there's different performances, different age groups that gather around, different classes and stuff. Twitter seems to be like professional middle class people. There's only 200 million people in the world on Twitter, which is a tiny amount. Yeah. Yet it has this huge kind of public influence. So there's kind of distinctions that happen between and within the platforms as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. So we need to go beyond the reactionary. I think Marwick's article, which was in the reading, is really fascinating in this sense that this idea of micro-celebrity and of being an influencer through fame through Instagram. And Marwick talks a lot about the platform itself and how it was an image-based platform with not much text, which was different to precursors like Facebook that required posts, often with lots of text and lots of other things, and could be the home to diatribes and all this kind of stuff. The simplicity of Instagram, especially before it allowed videos, was mostly just still image. And Marwick talks about micro-celebrity as a mindset and a collection of self-presentation practices endemic in social media, in which users strategically formulate a profile, reach out to followers, and reveal personal information to increase attention and improve their online status. Now, there's a question in there about why people want to increase attention and improve their online status, but I presume much of that is just a human need to begin with. There's not necessarily anything about the technology that creates that desire. We like attention, we like status, we like to be known. But this way we have much more control over how we're seen and perceived. These practices are pursued in view of the so-called attention economy, a marketing perspective assigning value according to something's capacity to attract eyeballs in a media-saturated, information-rich world. So that's how you go from just, here's some things about my life, to, these ways I present my life draw attention, to then other actors coming in and saying, that attention's valuable. That attention can influence.
Historically, and even from a class perspective here, I always kind of find it ironic, or maybe I'm a cynic, but the idea that kind of doing this stuff is somehow more narcissistic than, say, writing a novel. like, you know, like, so, like, you know, it's interesting. There's definitely kind of class, cultural capital things going on with this kind of stuff all the time. Where, like, you know, writing 500 pages around your own life is somehow less narcissistic than posting a selfie. So yeah, I just thought I'd point that out.
And even as we talked about earlier, like dressing up and going to hang out at the mall, which was a precursor activity to the same thing, attracting eyeballs and assigning value and assumptions about that. So again, I think we always want to get too caught up in the idea that this is all new and people are behaving in really strange ways. The technology is allowing certain things it didn't allow before, but some of the social behaviours around it are not that dramatically different.
Yeah, I think we said earlier on this, like, you know, there was moral panics around the printing press. So when technologies are invented and they become usable, people use them. But they don't always then use them in a way that they were necessarily designed for, and there's all these kind of affordances and risks and, you know, collateral damage and things that are unpredictable.
And I think what's great about Marwick's article is captured in this next quote is that the attention-getting techniques employed by consumer brands have trickled down to individual users who have increasingly and occasionally and improbably used them to increase their online popularity. So we talked in the first part of this topic, that blurring between kind of content creators and user content creators and how that's blurred and how their techniques blur, the aesthetics blur, etc., etc., etc. And I think Marwick hints at kind of lots of multiple spaces for this kind of fame. It gets realised in different ways and to different levels and to different effects. And she talks about Kane Lim, the luxury consumer, which if you think about it, Lim's claim in life is that he consumes expensive stuff. I mean, we think, how does that make you famous? Because he draws attention to products, his possession of them, use of them, unboxing of them, wearing them, trying them. He brings people closer to objects they might never be able to touch and feel. So he's almost like an intermediary or a gatekeeper between these kind of exclusive and prohibitive items and sort of an ordinary user and an ordinary person. And that bridge is really important, I think, for understanding how connectivity and consumption go together.
I see it as a development of like things like product placement as well. Like, you know, companies were paying tens of thousands of dollars to get their like brand names on Friends and stuff like that in the 90s. It's like, it's an embedment of this kind of consumer culture within, you know, wider dissemination of things. But it does seem to be in this way more personal. And like you can then kind of have a relationship with this person that's doing it that will maybe reply to your messages and stuff like that, where Jennifer Aniston wasn't replying to anyone's messages, right?
And you could make a calculation about Friends that, there's 10 million viewers each episode, and you wouldn't really think about syndication that much after. Whereas here you think, okay, that person has 25,000, and if that person has 200,000, and that you can same thing about getting things in front of eyes. I think it's a great product placement point. And product placement comes to people who didn't always start out to be in that game, and I think that's what's interesting. I think now there's far more intent with people wanting to be popular on social media, but I think even 8 or 9 years ago, people almost became accidentally influential.
Sometimes.
So Aurora and Sheba's article, Slumdog Romance, we also set for you this week. And I think why it's a really, really interesting one is that, one, it takes its starting point for social media use in the Global South. So that's also a really good starting point, because it's often not the starting point. That's always the exception against which examples are shown to be. It's not always true. It also happens differently there. And this really interesting and fascinating point about Facebook is the internet in lots of different places. So places where people, in say our society, people went from computers to computers on mobile phones, whereas in a lot of the Global South, people never had desktop computers or laptop computers. The first time they're engaging with that kind of ICT is through their phone. And that also Facebook, particularly when it launched that very sort of basic standard internet that anyone could access, became people's access to the internet in many places. I've certainly experienced this myself, and doing a lot of field work in South Asia was that's how you could access the internet if you didn't have the proper SIM, didn't have credit. There's a lot of what they call loops, so restrictive loops. So if you were in one state and you travelled to another, so it's like going from New South Wales to Queensland, your phone wouldn't work, so you had to use this really basic internet provider. So it's the way that everyone is connecting online. What's crucial in their article is that in societies where contact between potential partners, especially male-female, but not always, is heavily curtailed by family norms, right? In different religious groups, but across the board generally heavily curtailed. Facebook was a way to meet and socialise with potential partners and achieve a degree of intimacy. So what you're consuming here and what you're looking for is the prospect of intimacy, the prospect of partnership. And people always meeting each other this way and online. Or They meet in person and they continue their relationship communicating online, because it's really difficult to meet in person without gossip, without being judged, without their parents finding out, without all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so it becomes this really interesting kind of like back channel for intimacy and then for creating new intimacies. And so they argue that it allows relationships to develop which would have otherwise been difficult, especially across social barriers, so across big class differences, big religious differences, especially in their cases Hindu-Muslim differences, caste differences, and different ethnic groups. However, on the flip side, it's also led to violence, fraud, catfishing, blackmail, and negative impact, which are overwhelmingly gendered, like almost overwhelmingly felt by women.
Yep.
And transgender users of social media, and leads to a lot of blackmail, a lot of sort of slut shaming that so-and-so was with so-and-so, or talk to all these different people, and so can then be used to ask for money and all this kind of stuff, ruining someone's prospects, their family's reputation, etc., etc., etc. So it's interesting here how you have quite conservative norms and the introduction of ICT technology and the way in which they then entangle each other in these ways.
It reminds me of the research done with young people and mobile phones in the early 2000s, where parents would buy their teenager a mobile phone in an attempt as it kind of uses a digital leash to kind of know where they are all the time and be able to call them at any time. But then, of course, that technology of the self, that disciplining, kind of gets resistance. So if the 16-year-old is at a party somewhere, they'll hear the phone ringing and they'll run 4 houses down out the front and answer the phone, so they can't hear the party going on. Like, oh yes, I'm just stay here and everything's fine, right? Yeah. So again, the controlling aspects, the negative aspects, and the resistive and more positive kind of ways of being are kind of always kind of up for grabs in these kind of
and
technologies.
It's a really interesting point too about then the user finds ways to kind of get around that control.
Well, to use it for their own wants and needs and desires.
Yeah. It's also really interesting in these kind of situations too about how just passing time on social media is really common in the world over. Like I'm just going online and look for some people I can connect with and and hang out with and maybe talk to, because I'm so bored, right? Especially for young people who are looking for work or don't have work, or have been often migrant workers in another place, come back home, don't have much to do, small town, so you just scrolling online as we would into this kind of intimate sphere of connection, because it's hard to go to a bar, it's hard to go to somewhere else and just run into people and socialize, and so it becomes a proxy for that. And finally, for this part, I want to return to Miller, who we've talked about in the weeks on consumption, and a group of researchers from London School of Economics and other places, but I think that's where the project was funded and based, did this like big global project on why we post. Across lots of different societies. And I think it's a really fascinating project because it looks at 8 different countries, looks at in some places there's 2 sites, for example, like I think there's 2 sites in China and a couple of other things. But again, to I guess destabilize the idea that technology consumption is markedly different in highly technology societies versus societies where there's a much more unevenness, to sort of say, okay, well, how do people use social media in different places? Let's not make assumptions that it's a particularly affluent phenomenon or it's a particularly Western phenomenon. How do people use it in different places? There's a link there to the results. They've published a lot of it open access, and the screenshot you can see on screen shows the location. So they chose some pretty fascinating locations to think about social media use. I think the overall findings are really interesting, and I think that if you remember, Miller's quite generous with people's use of stuff, their consumption habits. So rather than this reactionary, judgmental, society's breaking down, as a research team, they designed an intervention that would have been much more open and much more willing to be led by respondents. And there are 3 main discoveries. There's actually a lot of detail to it, but there are 3 main discoveries overall. Is that 1, social media is not making us more individualistic. In fact, we often use social media to record time spent together. We go out somewhere, we like it, we take a picture, we remember it. There's a family gathering, we send it around. And particularly in a lot of these places where there's a lot of out migration, it became this really crucial way to stay connected with family members and share things in ways you couldn't by just using the phone or by letters. And even, for Chinese New Year, having a member of the family who's in another city and can't get home on a screen at the table and eating. So these things that are actually about not making you more individualistic, but about this kind of like deep connection and an affirmation of social relationships. Really, really fascinating. Second, that social media doesn't detract from education, that it is education itself, and so there's a lot of examples about people using it in schools in in the project to connect with people in other schools but in other countries, to think about other differences, to have forms of communication, especially for remote communities that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And again, fights back against this very reactionary rejection.
Yeah, there's a really famous example of like a bunch of kids in an art museum sitting around like on a pontoon looking at their phones, and there's all these people going, oh, they're in this great place of art, they should be looking at the art. And actually what those kids were doing, they're on an excursion. They're told by the teacher now to look this thing up and answer a question, right? So the photo doesn't actually represent the reality of what they're doing.
That's a great example.
So there's multiple layers of representation going on here, but the actual practice that they're doing in that in that museum's setting is using this technology to learn.
That's a great example. And of course, when I talk about the selfie in particular, because the project has a large part about that, is that there's many genres of the selfie, not just the face, and they give all kinds of fascinating examples from that about ways in which people show where they are and what they're doing, and particularly ways they kind of subvert the idea of the selfie, etc., etc., etc. But again, how curating and authoring your own identity isn't always about wanting your face to look like a movie star or someone famous. And there's all kinds of humor, there's all kinds of liveliness, and there's all kinds of like really human things that go into the selfie and the way it's shared and accepted, which is really, really interesting and really funny. And I really encourage you to look at this because it just is, again, it's a sober counter and a much more globally influenced way of thinking about. The more and more you look at these technologies in different places, the more and more you see that people do look at them as not things that run their lives, but things that complement their lives in really interesting and fascinating ways. Of course, there are examples where it ruins people's lives, etc., etc., etc. But find me a consumption item that doesn't ruin some lives somewhere. And so I really
hear about the disaster stories publicly. We don't really hear about the kind of 7 billion mundane things that happen online that are just kind of accentuating people's lives.
Yeah, and I think it's rarely useless. I think that's the point they make too, is that even when it's not harmful, it's rarely doing nothing. It's often doing something, and that something is often strengthening social relationships. Again, I don't think they go over the top, and there's certainly some things that I surprised me, but it's really, really fascinating. I really encourage you to check it out. All right, that's the end of part 2.